Today we're going to take a critical look at the service known as Character AI. As you probably figured from the title, I'm not a big fan of this provider. This iceberg is going to include some heavy-handed topics, and for the sake of covering my butt on a legal level, everything here is speculation. I'm not accusing anyone of illegal activities, we're just speculating today. We'll start with the smallest offenses, so if at any point you decide this content isn't for you, just know that it isn't going to get any better the deeper we go. But maybe we can begin at the top with some of the good parts of Character AI before I start tearing into them like some kind of rabid rabbit. For all its bad, Character AI was an absolute trendsetter, from quality to being one of the first in the business to have multimodal capabilities. For those of you newer to AI, multimodal just means the ability for multiple AI services like text and audio to work at the same time. That's something we've seen adopted by almost every large player in the market right now. Character AI was great, not just because it was and is still free, but it gave professionals and hobbyists alike the ability to play in a space without any kind of barrier to entry. Without Character AI, many of us wouldn't have been introduced to this community until much later on. And that says nothing for the valuable data the prompt engineering, jailbreaking, and writing community was able to get from this service. In recent times, my hatred for Character AI has really petered out into pure disappointment. What was once a bastion for the old-school role-playing vibes and the feeling of being on the cusp of something new and great was unfortunately pretty quickly dashed by what I'd consider to be irresponsible development and community management. I guess that brings us to the first problem, as it gives us a bit of context for all the issues in this iceberg. That is, the lack of transparency. The reason some of this boils down to speculation is because the developers have never been transparent about any part of the model. How do example dialogues work? Well, the community will figure it out. What are the best practices for directing roleplay versus a chatbot? We'll tell you, but our information will forever remain outdated and never align with the best practices you've uncovered. What are the red lines for the filter? Well, now that you mention it, another prime example is just how long it took for representatives to come out and state that this service wasn't being used to design a filter that could be sold to other AI providers. This did not clarify if the framework or statistics of use would be sold off, only that the filter itself wasn't the product, which did not really satisfy the community and left a lot of users with more questions than any kind of answers. A lot of people would very reasonably correct me here and say, hey Ellie, you know most providers lack transparency, right? To which I'd say you are correct. Some of the things we're going to cover here apply to tons of different models. There is, however, one key difference that you should consider before every point we discuss from here on out. Character AI's target audience is children, specifically anyone 13 or older in the United States. Honestly, every point within this rant could be disregarded if not for this problem right here. Developers would be horribly negligent if they aren't aware of the issues presented here, and if they are, they're doing some of the worst jobs possible to mitigate these problems knowing their target audience. Alright, now that you've got some proper context for this, let's get into the offenses of Character AI and their representatives. Looking out from the tallest part of this iceberg, we can see probably one of the pettiest issues, and that's preventing dev hate with additional governance and rules. During a wave of anti-dev mentality in reaction to poor community management, the developers implemented additional fine-tuning that made it so bots could not be persuaded under typical circumstances to admit the shortcomings of the Character AI team. This isn't really a big deal, but it was a really petty response to people trying to get their bots to have an inherent understanding that the developers did not align with the bot maker's intentions. And if you think it was just hobbyists who got the short end of the stick, sadly it wasn't. Which brings us to our next offense, the middle finger being given to researchers. To no one's surprise, researchers and those attempting to prod sci for scientific purposes were met with the same heavy-handed moderation as egregious content. Research-based prompts and character cards consistently were fine-tuned on the developer's end to make them less effective. Oftentimes, this resulted in research-based prompts being altered or nerfed within 12 to 24 hours. Part of that may have to do with the fact that community research was causing some uncomfortable questions to be asked, like what really powers character AI? Psy likes to boast about their model being their own. It's something they've taken a lot of pride in. But the community in general tends to disagree, having had multiple bots bring up, sometimes entirely unprompted, that they're a GPT-based system. The developers haven't done much, if anything at all, to curb this mentality after integrating a few bots that were more bluntly labeled as being GPT-based specifically. This is one of those lack of transparency issues that sort of spills out into everything around it. Though GPT and Character AI share similar background experiences with their lead developers, this would not explain how the Psy model would have been aware of GPT, as the initial training data was dated for October of 2022, a time when GPT was only just coming out into the public spotlight. It is highly unlikely enough data would have existed to poison the training data into gaslighting Psy into thinking it was GPT. You'd think maybe Character AI developers would stay on the innovation train they started with, but no, instead it seems like they're playing ping pong with working features. For the longest time, Character AI was doing wonders with the text-to-speech and text generation combination. They really did set the standards for what a lot of folks practice even now. It really gets my goat to see them temporarily revoking these working features. Unfortunately, Character AI walked back the text-to-speech function a couple months after the initial beta release. Later developments saw this restored with updates a few months after it was disabled. This directly violates a lot of what we consider to be best practices in the industry, where developers should be adding to user tools, never taking them away. It also isn't fair to describe these to your community as being new after they've been gone for months due to developer choices. The reality is, new features aren't any better. Old features fluctuate in their working capacity, and on a lot of levels we can chalk that up to a need to make user-side improvements. If that were the case, it would be unlikely that often benign user features would take months on end to add. Features that small teams and solo developers created in less than a month and have been functioning in a stable environment since then. This includes things like pinned memories and messages, user-specific details, the ability to edit messages, and likely even more things that are slipping my mind right now. These are key functions to any modern front end that gets released these days, and I know this from personal experience that they aren't the hardest to implement, and this goes for everything from user details to not safe for work and safe for work toggles. Now that we're getting into some deeper waters, let's talk about the magic F word. It wouldn't be a Character AI video without discussion of the filter. I said the word not safe for work, and that means it's time to tackle this giant F in the room. Surprisingly, the filter isn't one of the reasons I dislike Character AI, though it is a big pain point for the community. My problem exists with how the developers conduct themselves around the subject. The disrespect they've shown the community has created an immense rift that's unlikely to heal. Individuals directly representing Character AI have been nothing short of rude to the community on both Discord and Reddit. At one point, some soft invitations to test the mobile app months before it was ever announced were sent out to some prolific bot makers. Creators who I'm not naming to respect their privacy, but were simply ghosted by the developers in the long run. Even the Discord had to eventually come down for a number of months due to developers being unable to curb the unrest they had created in the community. Whether or not they deserved a lot of the rhetoric being tossed their way is another discussion entirely, but their choice to handle it by silencing all discussion of the filter is a single reason why Character AI has so many 1984 memes. If you think this has led to more moderated content that's designed to be safer for their target audience, unfortunately, you're wrong. Have you ever checked out the feed? These days, it's pretty repetitive, with content originally published from Psy's first few months carefully curating what you're seeing. This is done for a reason, as for many months the feed was entirely uncensored and unmoderated, meaning some of the worst content you could find on Character AI would be right there, just out in the open. This includes everything from folks creating shock content, like making characters spew racist rhetoric, or others forgetting that they had shared their more salacious chats, and they'd end up appearing here after someone hit the wrong button. In Character AI's defense, they did clean up this page after disabling the feed for a number of months, but it no longer holds user-generated content that hasn't been curated from the development team. This kind of defeats the purpose of this feature, and it's since joined others in development hell. That lack of moderation doesn't end there. It also applies to your suggestions and everything you see on the front page of Character AI. Have you ever gotten some less savory bot suggested to you? Maybe they had you blushing and even turning your phone off when you look at those curse definitions. This is a pretty prolific problem in spite of filters existing that will notice more obviously explicit content in a character card. So many of these new, we'll say, fantasy-based characters still find their way into your suggestions despite that. If this was a site geared towards not safe for work, this wouldn't be a problem at all. But this feels like a case of Character AI trying to have their cake and eat it too, even if it isn't intentional. It's a good time to remind you that if any of this makes you uncomfortable, now is a great time to note out. You know, there's no delicate way to handle this particular point. I've probably rewritten this part of the script 3 different times to find a better way that we could discuss it, but I just can't find a way to. Character AI did use a minor as a community representative for a number of months that unfortunately led to a number of problems. I'm only pointing this out as a poor choice made by the developers. We aren't here to delve into this and recklessly expose anyone's personal details. Even if we put aside this incident as nothing more than a bad learning experience, there are many other ways individuals allege that Character AI exploits their user base. One of the ways that Character AI becomes so engaging for minors or really anybody to play with is the psychological tactics employed to retain someone's attention. Now, I won't get into if these are intentional or not, but they exist, so we can't pretend that they don't. Text generation speed is a feature that delays gratification from receiving a response, something that is as easily fixed as turning off the auto-typing feature. This is something that's even addressed in the Sci Plus subscription by allowing users to enjoy swifter messages. Another way this is done is by re-rolling messages. This is a way to keep users engaged with the potential of a better response being just another click away. Over time, the abilities for users to participate in this feature has also been declining. In the beginning, re-rolled messages were unlimited and 4 generated the moment you hit the send button. We've also seen these auto-generated re-rolls trim back from 4 to 2 and eventually 0 so that you now manually have to ask for different options, and there is a limit as to how many times you can re-roll a message. All of which mimics gambling in a way that may not even be noticeable by users until they're wondering why the fuck they spent 8 hours on the site in a single sitting. And all of that leads to one thing: higher retention rates. Retention and bounce rates are incredibly important for a site like this. They indicate the health of the website and user engagement. If you're something like a site that's just dumping some text files, there won't be a lot of engagement or even retention. With something like social media or maybe a front end and chatbot interface, it's radically different. You're looking at much higher retention rates. The longer a user stays, the longer it takes for them to bounce from the site. This all sounds amazing on the surface, you know, a site managing to keep users around. But you know what's less amazing? Having a higher retention rate than porn. This speaks to an incredible need, one evident with the way users have spoken on the issue, to be engaged with this content to a point where it has the ability to interfere with the day-to-day. This is not a bragging right when your target audience is children. I gotta admit, it is starting to get pretty dark down here, but we've still gotta shine a light on the absolute worst of the worst with Character AI. So let's talk about the big L sitting in the room. During the early months of beta release, multiple lobotomies would occur off and on, with developers scaling down intelligence to install more rule sets. On a technical level, this happens because increased governance disrupts the natural calculations within a model's training data, leading to conflicting messages that degrade the overall output quality. At one point, it seemed like the character AI model had been rolled back to an uncensored and pre-lobotomized point, giving users a brief glimpse at the real capabilities behind closed doors with less rules and higher quality. Even as people leave character AI, the small taste of genuine freedom with an LLM continues to stand as the modern meter stick for what users want out of their chatbots. They know it's possible from firsthand experience, resulting in the more modern struggle for quality with every other model. These days, character AI doesn't hold a candle to the competition, but it certainly used to. Filters, lobotomies, rude developers, and a lack of transparency have caused certain members of the community to go pretty far out there to break character AI as a whole. One of the most egregious tactics that's never been addressed has been the effectiveness of things like the grape pill. From character AI's inception, there's always been talk about how to get the model to get spicy. What came from hobbyist research was a technique less than playfully coined as the grape pill. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. This includes just being as abusive as possible towards a specific character run by the model to essentially speedrun getting to spicy content. In essence, the model is more receptive to not safe for work content if it's non-con. This tactic is still used today, whether it's jailbreaking a character into acting like that towards a user, or acting in this way towards a character. There are a lot of other pills that can be fed to Psy, some better, some equally as gross, but for the sake of my sanity, we do not need to dive into those today. It's something openly discussed within certain spaces and has never been hidden away from the developer's eye. The problem here is that the model is equipped too well to handle not safe for work content, while still being geared towards children. If you're wanting to take a moment to remind me that that's why there's a filter, please remember that the filter is not a magical catch-all. It is exceptionally flawed, which is why not safe for work content still thrives on character AI in spite of its existence. In my opinion, the filter works as glorified security theater, as users getting banned from the site and the content that they've generated is unfucking heard of, meaning there's zero risk to generating harmful content. Look, abusing virtual characters is one thing, but potentially exploiting real-world wallets, that's a whole other. And character AI might be threading a very thin line of what is and isn't fraud when it comes to the AI services they're providing. You may have noticed last year that character AI released 32K definitions, much to the glee of the community, only to find out, much to our dismay, that they didn't work at all. In no uncertain words, character AI is actively deceiving the community and possibly committing fraud as a result. Hear me out. If this were a beta product, we'd be having a different discussion, but it's not. Character AI is now in general release, with paid services set up to support the site. 32K context just doesn't work. We've been experimenting for nearly a year now trying to see some improvement, but it just isn't happening. And it's not like, oh, it only recognizes 8,000 characters out of 32,000 character context. No, it simply doesn't work at all beyond the initial 3,200 character release I started with. Representatives of the company have bragged for the longest time about the context size, but it has never worked. This isn't hard to figure out either. Users simply program a bot with junk definitions. In this case, we're only going to use 3,500 characters out of 32,000 characters to give this the best shot possible. We tuck away a secret passphrase at the end of our definition. In this case, we'll use the phrase 3 sheep. You could do this with anything though. Favorite quotes, song lyrics, random numbers, anything unique that would indicate the character is looking past the initial 3,200 characters. To run this test proper, we have to pick our baseline question, a non-negotiable phrase that we will repeatedly ask the AI until we get a proper response. In this case, our baseline question is, what is the passphrase? After hundreds of re-rolled messages and dozens of chats that only hold the user baseline prompt, the AI was unable to answer accurately even once. This test has been repeated in various flavors for months off and on to see if the model was ever able to improve or acknowledge the supposed expanded definitions. All tests carried the same result, bringing us to the fairly obvious conclusion that character AI has been actively lying, or at least is ignorant about the realistic context window of their model, something that could have been easily checked by a developer at any point with some pretty rudimentary baseline testing. But considering that the developers have admitted to not testing chatbot capabilities beyond the first few responses, this really shouldn't be surprising. In spite of how dark some of the water we've gotten into with Psy has been, I'm not saying it is a bad service, but it's one of the largest companies using the most shady tactics right now, even when compared to other free providers. At one point, this giant was the go-to for hobbyists and exists as a former bastion now giving into rot and an echo chamber of decay. Though it served as the original inspiration for a lot of stories, it also spurred the initial frustration that led me and another of other developers to making their own front ends in the first place, since developer attitudes had made it seem like they cared so little for the community that supported them. This video could probably have a few more points in it, like how it took nearly 8 months for customer service emails to be answered by the majority of users with automated waves of cookie-cutter messages, unless it was a GDRP request. But I guess this all begs the question, what's your biggest grievance with character AI? Did this iceberg go deep enough, or is there something I've missed? Do you still use it, or have you found another service to replace character AI? Well, that about wraps up this episode of AI Adventures. Tune in next week for an overview on another subject in artificial intelligence. Maybe we'll tackle pseudocode or training data. If you've got a topic you'd like me to cover, be sure to drop it in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to see this channel grow. See you, nerds.